Ankelium Down, written by Nik Hein, narrated with the help of the AI.
Chapter 7. The reserve power unit bay was lit only by emergency lighting. Under normal circumstances, that alone would have put Dams on edge. But after hours of wandering through the bowels of a galley, overrun by unknown hostiles, he almost got used to seeing systems offline, disabled, or running on backup. From the look of it, the reserve energy block had never been activated at all. Most likely, the aliens had captured the main energy controls before ship-wide power distribution began failing. The three men crossed the room in near silence, walking between towering reactor columns bathed in dim orange-red light. Dam's inmate slippers made him practically silent, but the footsteps of Niels and Eric echoed far across the vast, empty space, bouncing back off the walls as muffled ghosts of sound. That was worrying. Any such noise was a risk. But the vast room was empty. No crew, no slaves, no aliens. The thick, dark columns of the reactor core stretched away in neat rows, and the effect was oddly ritualistic, like walking through an ancient temple built to honor forgotten gods. You almost expected to find just around the next corner a marble altar, a sacrifice laid out across it, and stern, bearded priests waiting with curved bronze knives in their hands. Dam smirked at the image, a half-memory dredged from somewhere deep in his brain. As a kid, he'd been obsessed with old myths, fascinated by their strange blend of beauty, elegance, and primitive simplicity. Later, as he grew up, he'd realized not much had changed since the days people whispered stories about Prometheus. And after Camp Gratitude, he'd understood completely. Those old metaphors still formed the spine of the brutal reality they all lived in. At the exit from the power block, Dams called Eric, and the three of them regrouped at the doorway for a brief pause. According to the map, the red zone starts 2 sections ahead, Niels said. But we've got no idea what's happened there in the last 30 minutes. The aliens may have expanded their control. Which means we stay frosty, Dams nodded. Eric, I get it. Walking point in a situation like this isn't exactly a safest option. But someone's got to do it. Sorry, but I still can't give you a weapon. Afraid I'll start shooting at you? Eric asked, just a bit calmer now, but still visibly edgy. Dams shook his head. Sure, Eric was right. That was part of it, but it wasn't the only reason. If you're carrying the rifle and something happens to you, we lose our only firepower, he said. And out of the three of us, I'm hands down the best shot. So, Eric shot a quick glance at Niels. The older man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Dams caught it anyway, though he didn't show it. He could only hope the two overseers weren't quietly scheming something, and that the look between them really was what it seemed. A silent reach for reassurance, for steadiness, in a situation spiraling into madness. Just beyond the power unit is the maintenance block, Niels said. Smaller in size, but somewhat spacious. It's full of equipment racks, junction consoles, kind of a maze. I've been there a couple of times, Eric said. I'll manage. Dams looked at Eric, then at Niels, and gave a nod. Let's move then. Niels pressed his palm to the lock's biometric panel. The door slid open with a smooth hiss. Eric cast one last look over his shoulder at Niels, then cautiously stepped into the darkness beyond. He moved a few steps in and paused, eyes straining to adjust to the dimness. Dams and Niels followed close behind. The room was indeed smaller than the reserve power unit bay or engine deck from where Dams had narrowly escaped earlier. He shook his head slightly. No more than 2 hours had passed since he stepped out of solitary, but it felt like a year. The chaos along the way to the engine deck, the creatures, the frenzied slaves, His escape with Niels, the desperate attempt to reconnect the comms, the fight with Eric. So much had happened in some 100+ minutes that it totally eclipsed all the memories from his time at Camp Gratitude. Dams knew the crash would come later, when the mission was over, or he was safe, or simply had time to breathe. The weight of it all would catch up to him like a wave. Conflicting emotions wrapped in exhaustion, always delayed. That's how it had always worked after the toughest operations. The only question was whether he'd live long enough to feel it. But now wasn't the time for reflection. Dams scanned the room. Nothing here, at least near the power block exit, suggested recent activity. No signs of crew, no signs of aliens. The usual dull red emergency glow filled the space. The usual heavy silence hung, broken only by the soft, constant background hum, vibrating through the bones of every spaceship ever built. Eric moved carefully between two rows of tall cabinets, eyes darting nervously from side to side. Dams knew exactly what the kid was feeling. He'd crept like this himself, more times than he could count, through dark corridors on stations overrun by terrorists, or winding tunnels deep in rebel strongholds, always waiting for that first shot from a hidden position. But back then, Dams had always had a squad at his back. Trained pros, armored and loaded for bear, as much as he usually was. And yet, now he couldn't give a rifle to a guy who, 20 minutes ago, had been aiming that same rifle at Dams's chest. As it turned out, he made a small mistake. The attack didn't come from around a corner. They were about halfway through the room when a scraping noise echoed from above, the sound of fast steps on metal, like some animal scrambling across a tin roof. All three of them snapped their heads up. The ceiling here, after the cavernous power hall, felt almost claustrophobically low. Two air vent covers came crashing down, and from the gaping black ducts, figures began dropping. Humanoid. Once. For just a moment, fate must have been feeling merciful, because the first pale shape didn't land on Eric, but a few steps in front of him. He stumbled backward, slamming into a metal cabinet with a loud clang. Another one landed beside him a second later, on all fours, like some kind of forest predator. In the dim red emergency lighting, Dams's first thought was, the aliens, especially with the way their skulls stretched long and smooth in the back. But then one of them turned, and the faint glow lit its face, and Dams flinched. Hairless, sagging skin, sunken, blank eyes, no expression, no soul. That was definitely a galley slave. But how the hell could a human being, long since stripped of will, with muscles half atrophied from neglect, move with that kind of speed, coordination, and intent? The slaves Dams had encountered on the engine deck had been pretty horrifying, but slow and chaotic. A shambling horde of lifeless zombies he'd scattered with ease. These were different. They moved fast, deliberately, with control, but there was no time to think. Eric landed a wide, desperate punch to the first attacker's jaw, knocking the thing back before it could latch onto his throat. But the second slave pounced on him immediately, and more were spilling from the vents by the second. Everything Dams had felt during his months in the labor camp, the fatigue, the disorientation, the numbness, all of it vanished. The tired convict was gone. The soldier was back. Dams raised the rifle and opened fire. Flechette rifles were perfect for this kind of combat. Designed specifically for use aboard spacecraft, where traditional ballistic weapons were more liability than an asset. It wasn't the threat of hull breach that made bullets risky, not on something as massive as a prison galley anyway. It was the ricochets. The flechette rifle fired small dart-like projectiles with explosive microcharges in their tips. They couldn't punch through a ship's outer hull, but in human flesh, they tore monstrous wounds, the kind you didn't want to look at unless your stomach was made of reinforced steel. The slaves surged forward and dropped one by one as dams cut them down in near silence. Eric, now flat on the deck and tangled with whatever attackers had survived the first volley, struggled and thrashed, but that was actually to his benefit. At least, he was out of the line of fire. Once the onslaught eased, dams could drag Eric clear of the squirming pile of half-dead flesh. But now, it was time for one thing only: to kill. Behind him came the unmistakable sound of bare feet slapping against metal, followed by impacts, grunts, and strained, choking breaths. Obviously, Niels had his own batch of berserk living tools to deal with. By the time the wave of attackers had run dry, dams had already swapped magazines once and burned through half of the second. Eric, meanwhile, had finally managed to fight off the slaves piling on top of him and had crawled back a few meters, panting and bloodied. Breathing hard himself, Dams lowered the rifle and checked his surroundings. Bodies were everywhere. Most were piling up directly beneath the two air vents, but not all of them. Some lay where Dams had dropped them on their rush forward. Others sprawled near the right-hand row of tall server cabinets, where Eric had been locked in a desperate tangle of limbs and violence a moment ago. Dams turned and saw Niels sitting on the floor, his back against a metal cabinet door. A handful of nearly naked corpses lay scattered around him. "Got jumped from behind around the corner," the overseer said with a wince. "Must have been another vent over there. I'm fine, more or less." Dams took a step toward him, but Niels waved him off. "I'm okay, really. Scratches and bruises and feel like shit, but that's all. How's Eric?" Dams nodded and dropped to his knees beside the younger man. Eric was a mess, head to toe, drenched in blood. Not all of it his. Then again, so was Dams. The young overseer's eyes were closed, his breath coming in heavy, ragged bursts. "You hit?" Dams asked. "Don't move. Just tell me." Eric hissed sharply through clenched teeth. "Feels like I got shoved through a meat grinder," Eric muttered. "Maybe cracked a couple ribs. But otherwise, I think I'm in one piece." "They were weak," he added, sucking in another shaky breath. "But fast. Damn. I've never seen galley slaves move like that." "Or show aggression," Niels added from across the room. "Except that one time with you, tough guy. On the engine deck." Dams shot to his feet, rifle snapping up into a ready position. Both overseers, slower and visibly aching, followed suit. The thought hit Dams like a jolt, the earlier theory about what had driven the slaves to attack him first time. The aliens. Could they be nearby now, close enough to exert mental control over the horde? But if so, why hadn't they just mowed everyone down with those energy weapons while the humans were busy wrestling a wall of feral bodies? And besides, Dams felt nothing. No mental push or pressure behind his eyes. None of the usual signs. But then again, that didn't mean anything. If the aliens were anything like high-level members of the Imperial genetic line, they could easily direct psychic energy in a targeted, selective way. Just like the Imperial Family could. From where they stood, the exit from the maintenance room was already visible. Beyond the doorway, there was nothing. No people, no equipment, no strange figures with elongated heads and legs that bent the wrong way. Dams relaxed a little and lowered his weapon. It looked like the slave attack had been a separate event, not directly tied to anyone actively controlling them, which, in itself, was strange and unexpected. "What the hell is this?" Niels suddenly said. "It's like it's grown right into the skull, and they all have these things." Dams approached the overseer, who was crouched over one of the slaves' bodies. During the fight on the engine deck, and even during the frenzied attack, just minutes ago, he hadn't had a chance to properly examine the attackers. A few details had stuck in his memory, of course, but more like a collection of blurred snapshots, taken from odd angles and in bad lighting. Throughout all the helter-skelter, Dams had been too stunned to remember everything around him. Dams had seen his share of dead bodies, more than enough for one lifetime, both victims of violence and of more mundane causes. In most cases, he could tell if a person was dead or alive at a glance, without checking for pulse or breath. He had never been religious, but he always felt that death took something subtle with it, something you couldn't pinpoint or describe, but the absence of which he could sense with near-perfect certainty. Now, as he examined the slave closely, he suddenly understood what had frightened and repulsed him most about these living tools. A dead slave was practically indistinguishable from a living one. That feeling of missing life force that Dams always got while looking at corpses simply wasn't there. As if it had never existed. As if the slave had lost it long before his heart stopped beating. Suddenly, Dams realized he'd experienced the same feeling earlier, on the engine deck, watching those Ankelium zombies slowly rise from their pods. All other details, the pale, hairless skin, the sagging flesh, the sluggish movements, were secondary. He'd seen living people whose appearance was far worse. Like those hostages they'd rescued from the lower levels of the Deimos base, for instance. Dams had never before thought much about his uncanny ability to instantly recognize whether someone was alive or dead. Perhaps because he'd never encountered a paradox quite like this. A biologically functional human being that his sixth sense refused to acknowledge as truly alive. Even the nearly brain-dead prisoners at Camp Gratitude still registered as living people to Dams's senses. But these slaves, what exactly did concentrated Ankelium treatment do to them? What did the machinery of the galleys' mental drives, constructed under the careful oversight of the Emperor and his closest kin, actually extract from them? Whatever it was, it defined the difference between the living and the dead. It must have existed even before the founder of the Eternal Dynasty first discovered how to use Ankelium to enhance the mental abilities of those genetically predisposed to wield such power. Another unpleasant thought jabbed sharply into Dams's mind. It appeared that his unique intuition and his resistance to the mental commands of the Imperial Family might be phenomena of the same nature, or perhaps two sides of the same coin. The importance of this realization lashed at his consciousness like a cold, wet towel hitting bare skin. He understood that such a discovery could lead to profound and far-reaching conclusions, provided he had the chance to properly unpack and thoroughly consider them. But time was the one resource he desperately lacked right now. Dams reached out and turned the slave's head to get a better look at the back. He wasn't sure exactly what he expected to see, but what he found shocked him. Covering the entire back of the slave's head was a strange device, like a clumsy cranial implant hastily assembled by some half-trained prosthetist in a rebel hideout somewhere in the asteroid belt. It was too bulky, too crude, yet simultaneously too elaborate, filled with excess hardware rather than the neat, simple bone replacement plate, easily concealed by routine cosmetic surgery. It resembled a flattened cybernetic crab or spider, its thin metal legs burrowing deeply into the unfortunate slave's head. Around the edges of the device, and where the thin wires and probes penetrated the skin, seemingly burrowing deeper into the skull and the brain tissue, the flesh was inflamed and, in places, oozing fresh blood. The implant appeared to have been installed quite recently, and sloppily at that, with minimal regard for the subject's comfort. Its edges had simply been sprayed with quick-healing gel and then what? Sent crawling through the maze of ventilation shafts to hunt down surviving crew or prisoners? The idea sounded insane, Yet Dams couldn't think of a more plausible explanation. "That's some weird alien-looking shit," Niels murmured, staring intently at the implant on one of the dead slaves. "I don't see any markings, but it gives off that impression. The details, the material. I've never seen anything like it. And I've never seen slaves move this damn fast," Eric added. Apparently, he had somewhat recovered from the violent struggle earlier and was now studying the bodies of those who had very nearly killed him moments ago. "Makes you think, doesn't it? You think it's these implants that turn them into a rabid pack?" asked Dams, although he too was already starting to connect the dots. "But how's that even possible?" "The hell I know," Eric shrugged. "But one thing I do know for sure. We need to get out of here." He glanced involuntarily upward towards the ominous black rectangles of the ventilation ducts. Before any more fun drop on our heads. Dams knew the young overseer was absolutely right. As risky as their current path might seem, and their ultimate goal was questionable at best, remaining here, especially in a spot where they'd already been attacked, was nothing short of suicidal. They had to keep moving. Yet there was something he needed to do first. Dams turned toward Niels, extending a hand. "Give me that little toy of yours." Niels understood immediately, handing over the multi-tool, though with the clear, "what the hell for?" impression on his face. "Listen, we don't have time for tinkering with random shit right now," Niels said. "I don't know what you're planning, but—" "Oh, you must be damn bloody kidding me," he exclaimed, seeing what Dams was doing with the slave's body. The multi-tool was your typical, everything you need in one gadget, an evolution of the simple folding knife at its core. Dams unfolded the largest blade, steadied the corpse's head with his left hand, and plunged the blade carefully under the edge of the implant, embedded in the slave's skull. It took him no more than 5 or 6 minutes, during which Dams used several tools, including a smaller blade and the tiny pliers. As Dams handed the gadget back to Niels, Eric made a strangled noise behind him. A laugh, morphing into a coughing fit with barely suppressed convulsions. "We'll need to figure out exactly what these things are and how they're affecting the slaves," Dams said without turning around. "But we can't drag an entire body along. It'd slow us down. I figured since these implants look freshly installed, it shouldn't be too hard to extract one." He stepped closer to a faint emergency light and flipped the extracted implant over to inspect its backside. "I remember when we breached that extremist base on Ganymede, we had to manually remove explosive devices from—" Whoa! Even though Dams wasn't an engineer, much less a scientist, one glance was enough to tell him this device hadn't been assembled in any Imperial facility or even in some rebel's makeshift workshop. The backside looked even more alien than its outward appearance had suggested. Every single component, wire, and tiny screw was crafted from strange materials, made to unfamiliar specifications. Alien was truly the only word that fit. But the strangest part, though perhaps not entirely unexpected, wasn't the clearly alien origin of the device. Behind the electronic components and several thin probes that had been embedded into the slave's skull, Dams had to snap them off while removing the implant. There was something else. At the very center of the implant sat a small flat container made of transparent plastic, sloshing with a faintly fluorescent orange liquid. A concentrated solution of Ankelium. Several thin tubes branched out from the container, running alongside wires to connect various parts of the device. 2 of the tubes extended to the broken probes. Dams peered closer and realized that the blood dripping from the snapped ends had a distinct orange tint. "Looks like this thing runs on Ankelium," Niels said. Both overseers had stepped up beside Dams, studying the alien device closely. Or the slaves run on Ankelium, Eric muttered, deliberately turning his back to the corpse with the mangled head from which Dams had torn the implant. Why else would you be pumping it directly into their brains? I'm sure this is what changed them, Dams said, which is why we need to study it as soon as we get the chance, which we don't have right now. He wiped the device off on his pant leg and handed it to Niels. You carry it. I need my hands free, in case of more surprises. Niels gave a dry chuckle as he took the implant. Not that I don't need my hands free too, Niels muttered, but yours are clearly more lethal than mine or Eric's. Worst case, I'll smack someone with this thing. Now let's get moving. I just had a very unpleasant thought. Dams gave him a sharp look. He was already getting used to the fact that Niels's unpleasant thoughts had an unfortunate habit of coming true, usually in the most dangerous way possible. What kind of thought? Dams asked, lifting the rifle and checking the charge indicator. Just under half left. Slipping, he thought grimly. He should have needed at least a quarter less ammo to handle unarmed slaves. But it was what it was. He'd have to work with what remained. We just took down what? A couple dozen slaves, Niels said, and barely made it out alive. But there are over 2,000 of them on the galley. We just took down what? A couple dozen slaves, Niels said, and barely made it out alive. But there are over 2,000 of them on the galley.